A wild Mustang horse lies dying in the middle of nowhere, dragging itself across miles of unforgiving desert terrain toward a stranger's remote cabin. What happens next will challenge everything you believe about the bonds between humans and animals, and the incredible lengths both species will go to save each other. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The sound that would change everything started as a whisper against the wooden porch, a soft scraping that Jake Morrison initially mistook for tumbleweeds blown by the desert wind. But tumbleweeds don't whimper. Jake had been living in his grandfather's old cabin for 3 months now, seeking solitude after his divorce and the collapse of his veterinary practice back in Phoenix. The isolation of the Sonoran desert suited his wounded spirit perfectly. Miles from the nearest neighbor, with only the occasional coyote call to break the silence, he'd found a kind of peace in the emptiness. That morning, however, the emptiness brought him something extraordinary. The scraping sound came again, followed by a low, desperate whinny that made Jake's blood run cold. He knew that sound, the cry of an animal in mortal distress. Setting down his coffee mug, he moved to the window and peered through the dusty glass. What he saw made him question his own eyes. A Mustang mare, her once magnificent coat now matted with blood and dirt, lay collapsed on his porch. Her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps, and her dark eyes held a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Most shocking of all, she had clearly dragged herself here. The trail of disturbed sand and scattered blood drops led back into the desert as far as Jake could see. Wild Mustangs didn't approach human dwellings. They certainly didn't crawl to strangers' doors seeking help. Yet here she was, having somehow traveled what must have been miles in her condition to reach his isolated cabin. Jake's veterinary instincts kicked in immediately, overriding his amazement. He grabbed his medical kit, one of the few things he'd brought from his old practice, and rushed outside. The mare's eyes tracked his movement, but she didn't try to flee. Instead, she seemed to sink deeper into exhaustion, as if his presence had given her permission to finally stop fighting. Kneeling beside her, Jake began his examination. The injuries were severe, deep gashes along her flanks that spoke of a predator attack, likely a mountain lion. Her left foreleg was clearly broken, the bone visible through torn flesh. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and had lost a dangerous amount of blood. By all rights, she should already be dead. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, his voice rusty from months of disuse. "I'm going to help you." The mare's ear flicked toward his voice, and those intelligent dark eyes seemed to study his face. In that moment, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of being needed. This broken creature had somehow found her way to the one person in hundreds of square miles who might be able to save her. But saving her would require more than medical knowledge. It would require a miracle. Jake worked quickly to stabilize her condition. He started in 4-line, something he'd never attempted on a wild horse before, but the mare remained remarkably still, as if she understood that her survival depended on his efforts. He cleaned and sutured the worst of her wounds, administered antibiotics and pain medication, and fashioned a temporary splint for her broken leg. Throughout the process, neighbors from the scattered ranches in the area began to arrive. Word traveled fast in the desert, and the sight of a wild Mustang at Jake's cabin had drawn curious onlookers. Among them was Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist who worked for the Bureau of Land Management. "Jake, you can't keep her here," Elena said, her voice gentle but firm. "She's a wild Mustang. There are protocols, regulations. She needs to be transported to a proper facility." Jake looked up from bandaging the mare's leg. "She'll die if we move her now. Look at her condition." "She'll die anyway," Elena replied sadly. "These injuries." "Jake, you know as well as I do that the humane thing might be to eat." "No." The word came out harder than Jake intended. "She didn't crawl miles through the desert to die on my porch. She came here for help." Elena studied his face, seeing something there that made her reconsider her words. "I'll give you 24 hours, she said finally. "But if she doesn't show significant improvement, I'll have to make the call." As the crowd dispersed, Jake found himself alone with the mare once again. He'd set up a makeshift shelter using tarps to protect her from the sun, and he'd managed to get some water into her system. But her condition remained critical. "What's your story, girl?" he asked softly, settling beside her in the shade. "What made you trust a human enough to come looking for help?" The mare's response was to shift her head slightly, resting it closer to where Jake sat. The gesture was so trusting, so unlike anything he'd expect from a wild animal, that it took his breath away. Over the next several hours, Jake maintained a constant vigil. He monitored her vital signs, adjusted her four, and kept her wounds clean and medicated. But more than that, he simply stayed with her, talking in low, soothing tones about everything and nothing. He told her about his failed marriage, his lost practice, his retreat to the desert. He found himself sharing things he'd never spoken aloud, as if this wounded creature could somehow understand his pain. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, something remarkable happened. The mare lifted her head and looked directly at Jake. Her eyes, which had been glazed with pain and exhaustion, now held a clarity that startled him. She nickered softly, not the desperate cry of earlier, but something that sounded almost like gratitude. "You're going to fight, aren't you?" Jake whispered. "You're not ready to give up." The mare's response was to struggle to shift her position, moving closer to Jake's side. The effort clearly cost her, but she seemed determined to maintain contact with this human who had shown her kindness. That night, Jake slept on the porch beside her, wrapped in a sleeping bag and waking every hour to check her condition. Each time he stirred, he found her watching him, as if she were standing guard over his sleep just as he was watching over her life. By morning, the improvement was undeniable. Her breathing had steadied, the fever had broken, and she was showing interest in the hay and grain Jake offered. More importantly, there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a will to live that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Elena returned as promised, accompanied by Dr. Sarachin, a veterinarian who specialized in wild horse rescue. Both women were amazed by the mare's progress. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Chin admitted, running her hands along the mare's neck. "Her recovery rate is extraordinary. It's almost as if she's drawing strength from somewhere beyond her physical resources." "She's drawing strength from him," Elena said quietly, nodding toward Jake. "Look at how she responds to his presence." It was true. Whenever Jake moved away from the mare's side, she became restless, her ears tracking his movement. When he returned, she visibly relaxed, often stretching her neck toward him for contact. "This is highly unusual behavior for a wild Mustang," Dr. Chin observed. "They typically become more stressed around humans when they're injured, not less." "She's bonding with you, Jake." The implications of that bond became clear over the following days. The mare's recovery accelerated at an unprecedented rate. Her wounds began healing cleanly, her appetite returned with vigor, and she started attempting to stand despite her broken leg. Throughout it all, she remained calm and cooperative, but only when Jake was present. Jake found himself restructuring his entire routine around her needs. He moved his sleeping bag permanently to the porch, set up a more elaborate shelter system, and spent hours each day simply sitting with her, talking or reading aloud from old books. The mare seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice, often closing her eyes and relaxing completely when he spoke. It was during one of these quiet sessions that Jake first noticed something that would change both their lives forever. The mare had been resting peacefully when a rattlesnake slithered onto the porch, drawn by the shade and the scent of the grain. Jake, absorbed in his book, didn't notice the danger until the mare suddenly lifted her head and nickered urgently. Following her gaze, Jake spotted the snake coiled less than 3 feet from where he sat. Before he could react, the mare struggled to her feet, the first time she'd managed to stand since her arrival, and positioned herself between Jake and the rattlesnake, despite her injuries and the obvious pain the movement caused her. The snake, startled by the mare's sudden movement, retreated quickly into the rocks. But the message was clear. This wild horse had just risked her own recovery to protect the human who had saved her life. "Did you just?" Jake stared at the mare in amazement. "Did you just protect me?" The mare's response was to lower her head and gently touch his shoulder with her muzzle, a gesture of such tenderness and trust that Jake felt tears sting his eyes. Word of the unusual bond spread throughout the local community. Visitors began arriving daily, drawn by curiosity about the wild horse who had chosen to trust a human. Among them were reporters, wildlife photographers, and researchers interested in studying this unprecedented relationship. But not all the attention was welcome. Federal wildlife officials arrived with paperwork and regulations, insisting that the mare needed to be relocated to a proper facility. Local ranchers expressed concerns about encouraging wild horses to approach human dwellings. Even some animal rights activists argued that keeping the mare was tantamount to domestication, which went against her wild nature. "She's not a pet, Jake," Elena warned during one particularly heated discussion. "No matter how strong your bond, she's still a wild animal. She belongs with her own kind." Jake understood the concerns, but he also understood something the officials didn't. The mare had made her own choice. She had traveled miles in agony to find help, and she had chosen him specifically. To force her back into the wild now, especially before she was fully healed, seemed like a betrayal of that trust. The debate came to a head when Dr. Michael Torres, a federal wildlife veterinarian, arrived with a transport trailer and a court order. The mare was to be relocated immediately to a BLM holding facility, where she would eventually be released back into the wild. "I understand your attachment," Dr. Torres said, not unkindly. "But this situation has gone on too long. Wild horses need to remain wild. This level of human contact is detrimental to her natural instincts." Jake watched as the transport team prepared their equipment. The mare, sensing the tension in the air, became increasingly agitated. She struggled to her feet and moved as close to Jake as her tether would allow, pressing against his side with obvious distress. "Look at her," Jake said desperately. "She's terrified. She doesn't understand why you're trying to separate us." "She'll adapt," Dr. Torres replied. "It's what's best for her long-term welfare." But as the team approached with the loading equipment, something extraordinary happened. The mare, despite her injuries and the pain it must have caused, reared up on her hind legs and struck out with her front hooves, clearly communicating that she would not go willingly. Her message was unmistakable. She was choosing to stay with Jake. The display was so dramatic, so clearly intentional, that even Dr. Torres paused. "I've never seen a wild horse react this way," he admitted. "Usually, they're eager to get away from human contact." Elena stepped forward. "What if we tried a different approach? What if we allowed Jake to help with her rehabilitation, but under official supervision? He could work as a volunteer with the BLM program." The suggestion opened up new possibilities. After several phone calls and consultations with higher authorities, a compromise was reached. Jake would be granted temporary custody of the mare under the condition that he complete certification as a wild horse rehabilitation specialist. The mare would remain with him during her recovery, but the ultimate goal would still be her return to the wild. Jake agreed immediately, though privately he wondered how he would ever be able to let her go. Over the following weeks, as Jake worked toward his certification, the bond between him and the mare deepened even further. She began following him around the property, her broken leg healing remarkably well thanks to his constant care and attention. He named her Hope, though he was careful to use the name only when they were alone, knowing that naming a wild animal was discouraged by the rehabilitation program. Hope's intelligence became increasingly evident. She learned to respond to Jake's voice commands, not out of training but out of apparent desire to please him. She would come when called, stand still for medical examinations, and even seem to understand when Jake was preparing to leave the property, positioning herself by the gate as if to accompany him. But it was her protective instincts that truly amazed everyone who witnessed them. On several occasions, Hope alerted Jake to dangers he hadn't noticed, from snakes to loose electrical wires to approaching storms. She seemed to have appointed herself as his guardian, just as he had become hers. The transformation wasn't one-sided. Jake found himself changing as well. The depression and bitterness that had driven him to the desert began to lift. He started taking better care of himself, eating regular meals and maintaining a schedule. He even began reaching out to old colleagues, considering the possibility of returning to veterinary practice. "She's healing you just as much as you're healing her," Elena observed during one of her regular checkups. Jake couldn't deny it. Hope had given him a purpose, a reason to get up each morning and face the day. But more than that, she had reminded him of why he had become a veterinarian in the first place, the profound satisfaction of helping a creature in need. As Hope's physical recovery neared completion, the question of her future became increasingly pressing. Her leg had healed completely, her weight had returned to normal, and her coat gleamed with health. By all medical standards, she was ready to return to the wild. But Hope seemed to have other ideas. When wildlife officials arrived to discuss release plans, Hope became agitated and uncooperative. She refused to load into transport trailers and became increasingly protective of Jake, positioning herself between him and any perceived threats. Her behavior made it clear that she had no intention of leaving voluntarily. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Dr. Torres said during a particularly frustrating attempt to load Hope for transport to a release site. "She's become too dependent on human contact. She may never be able to successfully reintegrate with wild herds." The comment sparked a heated debate among the assembled officials, researchers, and advocates. Some argued that Hope's attachment to Jake was unnatural and needed to be broken for her own good. Others contended that forcing separation would be traumatic for both horse and human, potentially undoing all the progress that had been made. Jake found himself caught in the middle, torn between his love for Hope and his understanding of what was supposedly best for her. The decision was ultimately taken out of his hands when Hope made her own choice in the most dramatic way possible. During yet another attempt to load her for transport, Hope broke free from her lead rope and galloped away into the desert. The assembled officials watched in dismay as she disappeared into the rocky terrain, certain that she was finally returning to her wild roots. But Hope had other plans. 3 hours later, she returned to Jake's cabin, covered in dust and breathing hard from her run. But she wasn't alone. Following behind her was a small band of wild Mustangs, a stallion, 2 mares, and a young foal. Hope had gone into the desert not to rejoin her wild family, but to bring them to meet Jake. The sight of the wild horses standing calmly in Jake's yard, with Hope serving as an apparent ambassador between the two worlds, left everyone speechless. Never before had anyone witnessed a wild horse actively facilitating contact between humans and her herd. "This changes everything," Dr. Chen whispered, hardly daring to breathe as she watched the unprecedented scene unfold. The stallion, a magnificent bay with intelligent eyes, approached Jake cautiously but without fear. Hope nickered softly, as if introducing them, and the stallion extended his muzzle toward Jake's outstretched hand. The contact was brief but profound, a moment of trust and acceptance that bridged the gap between wild and domestic, human and animal. Over the following days, the wild herd remained in the vicinity of Jake's cabin. They didn't approach as closely as Hope, but they showed no fear of human presence. Hope moved freely between the two worlds, spending time with both her human companion and her wild family. The situation presented wildlife officials with an unprecedented challenge. Traditional protocols had no provision for a scenario where wild horses actively sought out human contact through the mediation of a rehabilitated animal. Hope had essentially created her own solution, one that allowed her to maintain her wild nature while preserving her bond with Jake. After extensive consultation with wildlife biologists, ethologists, and legal experts, a groundbreaking decision was made. Jake's property would be designated as an official wild horse observation and research site. Hope would be allowed to remain with Jake while serving as a bridge between the human and equine worlds. The arrangement would be closely monitored and studied, potentially providing valuable insights into human-animal relationships and wild horse behavior. Jake was officially hired as the site manager, his veterinary expertise and unique relationship with Hope making him the ideal candidate for the position. The arrangement allowed him to continue caring for Hope while contributing to important research about wild horse behavior and rehabilitation. The story of Jake and Hope began attracting national attention. Wildlife photographers documented their daily interactions, researchers studied their communication patterns, and their bond became the subject of academic papers and documentary films. But for Jake and Hope, the attention was secondary to the simple joy of their continued companionship. Hope thrived in her new role as an ambassador between worlds. She helped other injured or orphaned wild horses learn to trust human caregivers, while also teaching Jake and his team about wild horse behavior and communication. Her intelligence and empathy made her an invaluable partner in the rehabilitation work. But perhaps most remarkably, Hope seemed to understand that her story had a larger purpose. When visitors came to the site, she would often approach them calmly, allowing them to witness firsthand the possibility of peaceful coexistence between humans and wild animals. Her gentle nature and obvious contentment challenged preconceptions about the relationship between civilization and wilderness. The wild herd that Hope had brought to meet Jake became regular visitors to the property. They established a territory that included Jake's land, creating an unprecedented situation where wild horses voluntarily shared space with humans. The arrangement benefited both species. The horses had access to supplemental food and veterinary care when needed, while researchers gained invaluable insights into wild horse behavior and social structures. Jake's life had been completely transformed. The broken man who had retreated to the desert in defeat had become a respected figure in wildlife conservation. But more importantly, he had rediscovered his sense of purpose and joy. Every morning, he woke to Hope's gentle nickering, and every evening, he fell asleep to the sound of wild horses moving through the desert night. The bond between Jake and Hope continued to deepen with each passing day. They had developed their own language of gestures and sounds, a communication system so sophisticated that researchers struggled to catalog all its nuances. Hope could sense Jake's moods and often seemed to know what he needed before he did. In return, Jake had learned to read Hope's signals with uncanny accuracy, understanding her needs and desires with an intuition that amazed professional animal behaviorists. Their story became a testament to the power of compassion and trust to bridge even the most unlikely divides. Hope had crawled through miles of desert, driven by an instinct that led her to the one person who could save her life. In return, she had saved his soul, giving him back the sense of purpose and connection he had lost. Years later, as Jake watched Hope grazing peacefully alongside her wild family, he often reflected on that first morning when he had found her collapsed on his porch. The sound of her desperate scraping against his door had seemed like the end of something, the final cry of a creature facing death. Instead, it had been the beginning of the most extraordinary relationship of his life. Hope had taught him that healing wasn't just about mending broken bones or treating wounds. True healing happened when two souls recognized each other across the vast divide of species and circumstance, choosing trust over fear, connection over isolation. She had shown him that sometimes the most profound bonds are formed not despite our differences, but because of them. The injured Mustang who had crawled to a stranger's door seeking help had found more than medical treatment. She had found a kindred spirit, a partner in healing, and a bridge to a new way of being in the world. And in saving her life, Jake had discovered that sometimes the greatest rescue is the one that saves us from ourselves. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who loves inspiring animal stories. Together we can spread a message of compassion and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals.